then lead the pursuing force into a trap. Caecina expected this to be a morale booster more than anything else, but things quickly got out of hand. The Othonian forces had already learned of Caecina's plan by way of Vitellian deserters, so when Caecina's cavalry arrived, the Othonians marched out in full force, now somewhere north of 13,000 troops, to overwhelm the trap. Though Caecina was tricked into attacking what he soon discovered to be the entire opposing army, delays and hassles trying to properly form up the mostly rookie Othonian troops allowed Caecina to call in reinforcements and extract himself from the debacle. Valens had arrived on the Italian side of the Alps, though he was still a good 50 miles from the action. When word came of the events at Placentia and Caecina's failed ambush, his army double-timed it to meet up with their comrades. The forced march, though, interestingly, was not actually Valens' idea. His troops, believing Valens to be dragging his feet and slowing the column down on purpose, literally marched off without him, forcing him to hurry to catch up. At this point, discipline in all of the armies was something of a joke. Prior to the ambush, a mutiny in the Othonian camp at Bedriacum, triggered by the men's belief that their commanders were insufficiently committed to the war, was headed off only when Otho sent his own brother, whose commitment could not be questioned, to take on overall command. During the ambush, a mutiny had broken out among Caecina's troops back in Cremona because they believed that their commanders were refusing to send them out in full force to relieve their comrades because they wanted to hang Caecina out to dry. Valens, meanwhile, endured one mutiny on his march that required him to slip out of the camp in slave's clothes, and then obviously a second one when his army disobeyed his orders and marched to Caecina's defense. Much is made of the notion that throughout the year of the four emperors, the common soldiers were running amok, and their commanders were simply trying to keep up. Much of this is probably overblown, but there is no denying that for this period of the war between Vitellius and Otho, the soldiers clearly did not trust their commanders, and for a while, the cart really did seem to be leading the horse. In the middle of March, Otho himself finally left Rome at the head of another 6,000 to 9,000 troops. The emperor settled with his accompanying forces in the town of Brixellum, about 15 miles from Bedriacum, where he too waited for the Balkan reinforcements. Soon enough, the first of these legions arrived, but by the time they showed up, Caecina's assault on Placentia had failed, and his ambush exposed as a non-starter. The Othonian army was eager to finish off what they saw as a fatally demoralized army. Was there really any need to wait for the rest of the Balkan troops? Even the arrival of Valens was not enough to put them off. With the casualties Caecina had suffered trying to take Placentia, and the arrival of Otho's force and the new Balkan legion, the two sides were now of approximately equal strength. By the middle of April, the ball was clearly in Otho's court about what the next move would be. The Vitellians, meanwhile, were holed up in Cremona, hoping that the inexperienced Otho, his 5 feuding generals, and their inexperienced legions would make a crucial mistake that they could exploit. Otho traveled to Bedriacum to hold a council of war, where the generals debated whether to attack now or wait for a more opportune moment. It seems, though, that the decision to attack at once had already been made, and that despite their valid arguments that it would be best to perhaps wait for the rest of the Balkan legions, those in favor of delay were seen as being overly timid and possibly working to undermine the Othonian effort. Delay, it was argued, meant losing the initiative and allowing Vitellius to send his own reinforcements. The only real open question was whether Otho would lead his army personally or return to the safety of Brixellum. It was finally decided that the emperor would follow precedent and remove himself from the field. If things went badly and he was out of harm's way, he would still be a rallying point and able to direct a counterattack. But if things went badly and he was in the thick of the battle, well, the death of Otho meant the death of the whole operation, as he had no heir and had not yet named a successor. The decision to fight itself was not the fatal mistake the Vitellians had been waiting for, but the way Otho's generals executed the decision most certainly was. Bedriacum was only about 30 miles from Cremona, but it took the Othonians 2 full days to reach the city. The delay gave Otho fits, as he sent dispatch after dispatch, demanding to know why in the hell they had not attacked yet. To make matters worse, on that second day, the Othonian generals, particularly Otho's brother, were not prepared for battle at all. Convinced that the Vitellians would remain sequestered in Cremona, he tried to lead the Othonian army around the city to a spot 5 miles past Cremona, where they would make camp and then finally, on day 3, goad the Vitellians into attack. But when Valens and Caecina saw the Othonians sort of rambling towards them, with all their baggage and carts and equipment weighing them down, they figured that now was the perfect opportunity to attack. So they did just that. Totally unprepared, the Othonians lined up in confused order when the full Vitellian army suddenly appeared on the horizon. Both sides were able to set themselves, and initially the battle was little more than a series of skirmishes. But then the two lines crashed into each other, and the armies got down to business. Though everyone comments that the untried Othonians fought far better than anyone could have expected, first their left flank and then their right were overrun. The Othonians broke and fled back to the safety of their camp at Bedriacum. The survivors spent the night trying to figure out what to do next. The Praetorians present wanted to keep fighting, but everybody else was ready to surrender. A delegation was sent to meet with Caecina and Valens to work out the terms. Otho received news of the defeat from survivors staggering into Brixellum that same evening. Though he still had reinforcements on the way, their loyalty was nominal at best. So despite the protests of the Praetorians surrounding him, Otho determined straight away that he had taken his one shot and missed. He could not in good conscience prolong a war that would only see more Roman blood spilt. He dispersed what money he had, encouraged his supporters to flee from the oncoming Vitellian wrath, and then went to bed, his mind firmly made up. If right now he was seen as a villain for having seized the throne violently, and then engaging in a war against his fellow countrymen, let future generations see him as a nobleman who died to stop the slaughter. On the morning of April 16th, he woke up early and stabbed himself in the heart. He was 36 years old and had ruled Rome, well, some of it anyway, for almost exactly 3 months. Who came to see Otho's noble death as one of the most virtuous in the whole long history of the empire, it would only stop the bloodshed for a short while. For many Romans, while Otho may have been a murderous usurper, Vitellius was a crass and unworthy man who would use the armies entrusted to him to engage in full-blown civil war without soliciting the Senate or the people's approval. Vitellius may have been popular with his troops and supported by a few provincial governors in the west, but the rest of the empire was a different story. The backers of Otho were not simply ready to resign themselves to Vitellius. Rather, they cast about looking for a leader to rally behind, someone strong enough to dislodge the Rhine legions from their newly won place at the top of the food chain. Naturally, their eyes turned to the east. Too far away to really take part in the events of the past year, the eastern legions, led by Titus Flavius Vespasianus, read about the unfolding chaos with dismay. When Vitellius, of all people, wound up on the throne, Vespasian decided to heed the calls coming in from his fellow eastern governors to bid for the throne himself. After all, had he not heard the prophecy that the future rulers of the world would emerge from Judea? Embroiled in the Great Jewish Revolt in Judea, Vespasian had not only heard of the prophecy, but he had come to believe it. Just a month and a half after his so-called decisive victory at Bedriacum, Vitellius discovered that practically the entire Eastern Empire, including the crucial province of Egypt, had declared for Vespasian. Despite Otho's best efforts, the chaos and bloodshed of the Year of the Four Emperors was far from over. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you are now aware, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 60,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again is audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you will qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the book that you downloaded. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I am pleased to recommend Lost to the West by Lars Brownworth, the Grandmaster of History Podcasting's book on the Byzantine Empire. It's even narrated by him, so yeah, you should go buy it. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 72, Vitellius and Vespasian. In April of 69 AD, the Romans watched Vitellius, their fourth emperor in less than a year, ascend to the throne. When Nero had committed suicide, conventional wisdom held that old Galba would reign for a few years and then hand power to an heir, presumably some young man with many years ahead of him. If anything, the death of Nero was supposed to open up a period of stability. But here they were 10 months later, and the Senate was recognizing yet another emperor. There was nothing anyone could really do about it, except hope that this, finally, was the end of it. But it was not to be. Vitellius would not live to see the new year, and before the final emperor of this chaotic period strode into office, there would be more bloodshed, more misery, more betrayal, and more destruction. Though he was of mild disposition and never would have ordered the crimes committed in his name, when the forces of Vespasian stormed into Italy on their way to Rome, they brought with them the worst civil war had to offer. It would be a bloody end to a bloody year. The only silver lining was that it would be an end. Vespasian would reign for years, not months, and his sons for years after that. The luck of the Flavians would see to that. The suicide of Otho had taken everyone by surprise. Friend and foe alike expected the young emperor to fight it out with Vitellius to the bitter end. After going to such extreme lengths to seize power, it was inconceivable that he would simply give up after suffering what could be seen as no more than a minor setback at Bedriacum. But rather than receiving further instructions, the legions that had pledged their loyalty to Otho were simply informed that their leader was dead. And rather than preparing themselves for the next battle, the legions that had pledged their loyalty to Vitellius were simply informed that they had won. No one knew quite what to do next. Vitellius, though, knew exactly what to do: throw a huge party. The new emperor, not officially designated as such yet, was staying in Lugdunum, the Roman capital of Gaul, when he got the news that Otho was dead. Valens and Caecina were told to make sure their respective armies were in order, and that the enemy was fully subdued, and then they were to make haste to Gaul for an extravagant banquet. When the two generals arrived, they sat on opposite sides of the new emperor at the main table, and everyone got good and drunk, singing each other's praises and mocking the Othonians well into the night. The excesses of the victory celebration would set the tone for Vitellius's reign, or at least the historical depiction of Vitellius's reign, which may or may not be the same thing. The problem for Vitellius is that none of the ancient historians were on his side. The men who recorded the events of the Year of the Four Emperors were obviously writing after Vespasian had emerged victorious, and I think we all know what they say about who gets to write history. Vespasian would have naturally